Mike McHargue grew up in a Christian home, but then became an atheist, became known some years ago as a popular podcaster named Science Mike, a science popularizer. And about 10 years ago, he developed some axioms for faith as an atheist. Now, Mike has since returned to the Christian faith. He's done some interesting interviews, for example, with Justin Brierley, talking about this as a very popular book on the subject. But back when he was an atheist skeptic, he wanted to consider how can he still remain open to spirituality, transcendence, a religious perspective on reality as an atheist. And so he developed these axioms of faith, sort of minimal starting points for building a bridge to a supernatural openness, transcendence, something along those lines. Honestly, it's very much, I think, in terms of its ethos, like my book, The Doubter's Creed, which I wrote a few years ago, a couple years ago, where I sought to build what I called an apologetic of agreement. Often Christian apologists, they begin by pointing out all the perceived inadequacies of alternative perspectives. For example, if you're an atheist, allegedly you have to be a nihilist, or you can't accept objective morality, and so on. And then the argument is, or the modus operandi is to create this sense of the inadequacy of one's current perspective, religion, philosophy, worldview, etc., so that they become Christians. But interestingly, like the Apostle Paul, as I note in the Doubters Creed, had a different approach when he came to, let's say, Mars Hill in Athens in Acts 17. He began not by highlighting the disagreements and the differences between his perspective and those of the other people gathered at Mars Hill, rather by pointing out the areas of agreement. So he noted that they had an altar to an unknown God, and he wanted to tell about them about that God. And he affirms the Stoics in the audience who would affirm the idea that in him we live and move and have our being, we are his offspring. And so Paul actually quotes from their philosophers and approves that as theological truth that he would say is indeed correct. And in this way, he begins to build a bridge with his audience. And I see Mike's axioms of faith as doing something similar. Now, I had not actually heard of, although I knew of Science Mike, I had not heard of his axioms of faith until this past weekend when a friend of mine said, "Hey, you should take a look at them and see what you think of them, and whether you think those are valid apologetic starting points for people in discussion with Christianity." So I decided I would take a look at them, and I'm going to devote some videos to them. This first video is just going to talk on the first of the 11 axioms, which is on faith. And I'm not going to commit to making more because when I've done that in the past and the initial video hasn't garnered much interest, I haven't been motivated to do more. So if there's no interest in what I have to say about Science Mike and axioms of faith and the concept of faith itself, I probably won't bother to do more. But if there is some interest in it, then I will probably do follow-up videos on more of the axioms, 11 axioms that he presents. So let's begin by taking a look at his axiom on faith. Well, it says faith is at least a way to contextualize the human need for spirituality and find meaning in the face of mortality. Even if this is all faith is, spiritual practice can be beneficial to cognition, emotional states, and culture. So it seems to me that what Mike wants to do here is say, look, even if you're skeptical of organized religion, you should be open to the concept of faith, first because it's a very general concept that can encompass all sorts of non-personal theistic accounts of reality, and there can be pragmatic benefits to the pursuit of faith along these lines, including that it can benefit your cognition, your emotional states, and the general culture. So that's the basic picture. Uh, I want to begin by pointing out two different concepts of faith, and then we'll come back to this. So the first thing I want to note is that I would say while the word faith has many different possible meanings, or in other words, it can be used with respect to many different terms, there are two basic categories or kingdoms of faith. I would, as I would put it. The first is when you use the word faith to refer approximately to religion. And in that sense, you say, I have a faith, meaning I have a religion. The second way to use the word faith is to talk about it as roughly approximate to trust. So I have faith, meaning I trust. I have faith in my mechanic to fix my Ferrari, means I trust that my mechanic can fix my Ferrari. I have faith in the engineers that designed this bridge that I'm currently driving over, means that I have trust in the skills of the engineers to design a bridge that will hold my weight and the weight of my vehicle as I drive over the river, and so on and so on. That's faith. So, with that in mind, it seems to me that Science Mike's first axiom is talking about religion in the first sense, not about a basic trust, but rather about something broadly like religion, where it encompasses a dimension of spirituality, where it's grappling with the problem of human finitude or mortality, as it references, and deals with what I would broadly call transcendence. And in that sense, Science Mike says we all can have faith in the sense that we're all recognizing there's a problem of human mortality. And I think more broadly encompassing that is suffering in the world. We all want to try to understand suffering. We all want to have some pursuit of human transcendence. We want to have some concept of, if not immortality, then something goes on after us. We're looking for purpose, telos, meaning in life. All of these things, it is the human pursuit. And there's a term for this. The term is homo religiosus, the idea that we are meaning making creatures, that we pursue meaning, that we look for meaning, that religion is a universal pursuit. And along the lines of that, I don't want to anticipate what we're going to say about God, but Paul Tillich talked about God as one's ultimate concern. So within one's belief system, whatever is the ultimate norming norm, value, around which one organizes their life and finds meaning, that is functionally God within your belief system. And in that sense, we all have a religious perspective, all have a sense of God, of a belief system, and we're all pursuing that. So that's the first sense, I think, a very broad sense of understanding faith as like religion. And I think there's value in what Science Mike is doing here with his axiom. But I would also want to put emphasis upon faith in the other sense, to recognize that we all have faith in the sense of we all need to trust. We all need to trust in something, in someone, in some other authority. You know, one of the clearest results I would suggest of the philosophy of knowledge or epistemology over the last centuries is that there is no God's eye point of view available to human beings. There is no certitude, no incorrigibility, no certainty that is not vulnerable to counterexamples or to the acid of skepticism. Think, for example, of Rene Descartes, famously arguing with the Cartesian method, says, I'm going to begin by doubting everything and say, well, imagine what if there's a evil demon that deceives me even to thinking 2 plus 2 equals 4 when in fact it equals 5. In other words, the surest deliverances of my cognitive faculties, my rational faculties, may be in error because of the deceptions of this evil demon. Well, then what can I know? And Descartes says you can still know one thing. You can know that you are a thinking thing because you are the very one raising these doubts and questions. Descartes is essentially plagiarizing Augustine's argument from a millennium earlier, si fallor sum, if I'm wrong, I still exist. And he's modernizing that maybe into cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. But critics of Descartes were quick to point out that if an evil demon can trick you into thinking 2 plus 2 equals 5, an evil demon can trick, quote unquote, trick you, quote unquote, into drawing a fallacious conclusion that there's a thinking thing from the maybe just the reality that there are thoughts. In other words, once you start the slide into skepticism, there's no clear way to stop that slide. And what that means is that you can't have the kind of God's eye point of view certainty that we look for so often. You have to start in faith. You have to start with trust. In fact, you start with trust and faith from your very earliest moments when you were born, and then you gradually learn language, and your parent holds up a spherical object and says ball, and you learn ball. That is a ball. And you learn that is mama and that is dada and so on. You begin to acquire language only because you start in faith. And that is the human condition. You must start in faith. So, what that means then is to put that into a first axiom of faith would be to say we all start with trust, vulnerability, we can all be wrong. And that, I would suggest, creates an orientation not just toward transcendence, but also toward a recognition of our own vulnerability and finitude and an openness to learning from others. And I would suggest that that is a fine complement to Science Mike's understanding of faith.